So my name is Moniqua Lane. My name is Moniqua Kenyatta Lane. Moniqua. Should I spell my middle name? Kenyatta Lane, Lane. I was born and raised here in Tucson, Arizona, at what was then Keno Community Hospital on January 21st, 1978. So I am 45 years old and love every second of it so far. My mother's name is Constance Louise Brown. That was her maiden name. My father's name is Lenwood Lane. My mother was born in Chicago. Moved here when she was about 2 months old, and my father was born here. What's, for me, interesting about my father being born here is that I feel like there's not a lot of Black people who are born and raised here. Not a huge Black community in Tucson, period. So to be second generation particularly is, or even third, I'm sure there's people that are more than that, but to have a history that goes back into some of the earlier days of Tucson as a relatively young town, and as a Black person is really interesting to me. And I suppose my grandmother, my father's grandmother, her name is Mary Louise O'Neill. She passed in 2019. Wasn't born here, but came here at the age of 13, which is actually when she had her first child. Can you imagine having a first child at 13? And then she proceeded to have 13 more of them. I should be able to name all my aunts and uncles on my dad's side. I almost want to give it a go. Can I give it a go on camera? I'm going to. So I think there's Archie Jr. My grandfather's name was Archie Lane. There's Ray. Then I believe there's my brother. And then I think there's my father, Lenwood, my Aunt Diane, my Aunt Marianne, my Aunt Julia, my Uncle Tim. That's only 7. I only got 7 out of 13. But certainly those are the relatives I have living memory of. Met all of them. My grandmother, I have some really fond memories of. She was, like a lot of African American families or Black families, sort of the matriarch of the clan, and she was, who held us all down. My grandfather was significantly older than her. He passed away in 1990 at the age of 86, and I should be able to do that math, but I can't. I do have an early memory of him. I believe that my parents were, my father particularly was born at St. Mary's, but raised in a house on Park and 25th, which here in Tucson, which is still standing because the family refused to sell to the housing developers who did student housing on that corner. So there's a little carve out there. And I know I've got cousins who still live in that house. But now as an adult and doing what I do, real estate development essentially, is probably one very, very small, probably very dilapidated front house, and one very, very small, probably very dilapidated back house. And my grandmother lived in the back house, and my grandfather lived in the front house. And as near as I can tell, a forest of electronics and junk with a QUE, of course, sprouted up between those two houses. And I have memories sort of playing and wandering among those canyons, those relics, sort of running back and forth between my grandmother's house and the front house where my grandfather lived. And of course, my grandmother's house, the back house, was sort of sweetness and light. She had her wigs that I could play with, and she had candy, and she was always cooking something, and just sweet as the day is long, sort of a gentle chiding, minding kids, etc. And I remember often being minded not to go to the front house and bother my grandfather. And of course, I did. And about the only memory, it is the only memory I have of him, is going up to that house one day, and he's sitting in a dark room at a front table playing dominoes. It's where I learned to play dominoes. I still do. And I don't remember who he's playing with, clearly not playing by himself. And he was pretty notorious for smoking unfiltered Pall Malls, I'm not sure which way you say that, and drinking Seagrams straight. So I remember running into the house. He's playing dominoes. He doesn't even look at me. He just says, "Child, go get my cigarettes." And so I was escorted by older cousins to the corner store to buy, like 7, 8, to buy a pack of cigarettes and bring them back to my grandfather, which I did. And that's really almost all I know of him. There's some rumors, a sharecropping family. Both him and my grandmother probably came to Tucson. I don't think together. I'd always assumed together, but they probably met here. But both came by cotton, basically picking cotton. My father from Texas, my grandfather from Texas, my grandmother from Oklahoma. It's interesting to think that Marana, of all places, is sort of the gateway for that. I don't know why I hadn't realized sort of the import of the history of cotton, Pima cotton we have here. And then I sort of, at some point in time, spent my adolescence in the Marana area at Cortero and I-10 when there was still an active dairy farm there and thousands of head of cows. And I remember at the time, 12, 13 or so, being shocked to learn that there are Black people who were born in Marana. And I'm like, how did you get out here? Like, how did I get out here, let alone how the hell did you get out here? And it's only sort of later as an adult that I'm sort of connecting those pieces. And of course, projects like this are instrumental to being able to put those sort of fragmented pieces together. So I'm excited to spend some time thinking about that particularly. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that my mom is white and my dad is Black. So I guess I wouldn't be remiss. I don't have to say it. But that's sort of another twist that I think is fairly interesting, is that that my deep connection to Tucson comes through on my father's side through, my Black heritage rather than my mom who, yeah, she's my mom. She's great and all. But, fairly conventional story. Came out here from Chicago like everybody else, came out here from the Midwest. They had me relatively young. They were 19 at the time when they had me, both high school dropouts. My father was, I believe, dropped out of school in 9th grade or so. My mother as a junior. She went to Tucson High. She met, weirdly, I want to say she met my father at Tucson High, but he, wasn't going to Tucson High. But a lot of his siblings did. I think she actually met him through my Aunt Diane, through his sister who was still in high school. So that's how they got together. My mother became pregnant with me, was kicked out of her house by her parents. And so this is a story that's told to me. Obviously, I have no living memory of that, but sort of bounced around my aunt and uncle's houses and my grandparents' houses until I was born. To my knowledge, my father sort of always worked labor and construction, and my mother went to college, went to the University of Arizona. In those early years, up till I was about 13, my parents divorced when I was 13, but up till that time, I've got real strong recollection of my father always being present, always being quiet, always being somewhat in the background, but always working incredibly hard to support myself and my mother, who did end up with a college degree. I have recollections of getting on the bus with her. It's the line that goes right on Pima. We lived sort of in the Oracle and Roger area. It's weird that these are coming up for me. And I went to a daycare. It's called Mary Moppet's, right there next to Holloway Elementary School on Prince and Campbell. And I have recollections of being dropped off on the bus line that went there, picked up, and riding to the U of A and going to classes with my mom for a period of time until she graduated. And just sort of, hazy early memories, but sort of sweet for me, sweet and fond. And I don't know why I'm going into this, but from that time period, just one other thing I remember, just a connection to my grandparents, I suppose, if you will, is every Christmas, we lived in a tiny little apartment, and every Christmas, apparently my grandmother would send a present to us as a family. I mean, we'd spend Christmas with them, so I don't know why this got mailed to us, but got mailed to us. And I remember being really, really young. I'd have to get up really early because my father worked construction and my mom put me on a bus to school. So it's dark in the apartment. It's dark at the time I get up. And it's around Christmas time and this enormous box arrives and I'm allowed to open it. And I open, this cardboard box that is otherwise nondescript and it's just filled with pecans and walnuts and oranges, and I'm sure Brazil nuts, other types of almonds, etc. And that was a very traditional gift that my grandmother sent every year until she passed away. Which is funny because I don't really have any fondness for nuts or mixed nuts, but I definitely associate it with Christmas and I get mad when I don't have them every year. I'm 45 years old and I could do it myself, but it never even occurred to me. So anyhow, that's, sort of, youth, or early childhood. Once my mother graduated college, that's when I was about 6 years old. That's when my parents had my brother, Marcus Nkrumah Lane. That's all I'll say about him. No, my brother's delightful and lovely. We work together, but they had him. And I believe once they had him, they got married shortly after they had him. And that's when my mother's parents, my grandparents, sort of came back into our lives. So somewhere at that time, we ended up moving fairly far away from my father's family. We were already north central, and my father's family was clearly on the south side. And so a little far removed from them, but still close enough to see them quite a bit. But right around that time, we moved up to the Cortero and I-10 area, essentially. And that's where I finished out high school, et cetera. So still maintain ties with my family, but just a radically different experience. Suddenly, I went from an experience of poverty to an experience of basically middle class, in the suburbs of Tucson, which was an interesting experience. It was an interesting experience for me. Not so much because I necessarily felt like any particular minority, though I was, but rather, as we were talking about before, we started, rolling film, rolling tape, or whatever it is you roll in this day and age. But because I was surprised at some of the diversity up there, a lot of military families relocated there. So I had a lot of friends who were, of course, at that time, the military, I think, was one of the vehicles for, middle-class status for Black people. So my best friend next door to me was a Black girl named Christine McKinney. Her parents and I are actually still in touch. They're still in town, but back on the east side. And I remember being surprised by that, just surprised finding a Black community, a very small Black community up in that area. And that's not even to touch on the Black community that existed in Moran. I met those people way later when I started getting into trouble as a kid, which is actually not true. I was a good kid. I went to, public elementary schools up there, went to private junior high, private high school, Greenfields Country Day, once in future Greenfields High School is where I attended and where I graduated from. That's attended so-so grades. I was a so-so student, not incredibly motivated to people please, but did well enough to get a scholarship to, a lot of colleges, frankly, to get partial scholarships to quite a few, to go out of state, and to get a full scholarship to a tiny college called Claremont McKenna out in California. So I attended there for a year, completely blew off a full scholarship and a year of college education out in California. They did offer to take me back, but I'm like, I should probably go home and reset myself. So I moved back to Tucson, worked my way through Pima, actually, and then worked my way through the University of Arizona, where I graduated with a degree in history and poli-sci. How I ended up as an attorney, well, I'm not. How I ended up as a real estate developer is a long story. But I have this sort of vivid recollection of I'm in my late junior year in college, and I'm on the path to be a history major. I'm assuming I'm going to get a PhD in history. And I just went, oh my God, I have to eat one day. I have to eat. What am I going to do? I can't be a history professor. So I go to my history mentor, my advisor, my mentor, and I, tell her about my misgivings. And she says to me, go to law school. You'll be fine. You can go back to history anytime you want. Go ahead, go to law school. That was a fateful turn for me. I did go to law school, hated every second of it. From the beginning of getting in, I kept trying to get out. Never, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I haven't yet revealed what I do, or maybe somewhere it'll say what I do, but never went back to history. I regret it some days. I really... the study of our past is the study of our present, is the study of our future. So I try to find other ways to be involved in it, like this, or I shouldn't say obviously, but like this. And that's important to me. But I went down the path of law, went to law school, sort of messed around in law school as well. Wow, I'm going to come across as a very unserious person in this, or at least academically unserious. But anyhow, went through law school fairly mediocre, but fortunate enough to, contrary to what this video looks like, fortunate enough to interview well, apparently, write fairly well. And I got hired by what was then a fairly prominent firm, Snell and Wilmer, right out of law school. They had a summer internship program specifically aimed at increasing their diversity, if you will. That's not what they called it, but basically a DEI program, or affirmative action, for which I'm incredibly grateful. Would be nowhere without that. Neither here nor there. I'd be nowhere without that. But started working there, hated that, absolutely hated every second of it. I started working there in 2004. Oh, I should say when I graduated. I graduated college in 2001, graduated law school in 2004, started practicing law in 2004. Does that math line up? Phew. I'm like, something like that. Anyhow, when I first started working there, they still made women wear skirts and pantyhose in 2004. So not quite the place for me. I stayed there for about a year, and that's the first time I left the practice of law to become a freelance writer. Had a little bit of a successful career as a freelance writer, mostly technical manuals, tax manuals. I did tax law basically at Snell and Wilmer, tax, estate planning, etc. I found that to be pretty boring, so I went and didn't pay the bills very well, so I went back to the practice of law. Hated it, left the practice of law for fundraising. Did okay with that. Didn't find it incredibly challenging. Now that I'm older, it's a terrifying and very challenging job to do nonprofit fundraising. But at the time, left the practice of law for that. I had a kid sometime in there too, and I got married too, twice. But we can get to that in a second. I'm just trying to remember my resume. Let's see. Left the practice of law, then. Then became the CFO, the chief financial officer of a charter school called City High for a year. Terrible at that job because, as we just saw, my math isn't that great. Left that job, went back to the practice of law one last time until 2012 when I fell into real estate, which is what I currently do. I own, operate, develop hotels, boutique hotels particularly, in and around Tucson. And I'll get to that part in a minute, but I did apparently leave out some important details of my life. So graduated college in 2001, got married to my high school sweetheart in 2001, a guy by the name of Lexus Mazursky, not from here, but I did meet him my senior year in high school. Short turbulent marriage. But we did have a beautiful child, Josephine Delilah Mazursky, my only child, my 15-year-old terror right now. Very well-behaved kid, but wow, 15-year-old girls, right? 15-year-old girls and their mothers is, that's probably going to be what I'm remembered for. Great, lovely, delightful child. I've done good. You'd asked before we started this what I wanted to be remembered for, and I thought I had that answer. But if I can send my daughter forward in this community and in this world to make a positive contribution, then I have done everything I need to do, and I have been remembered in the way I need to be remembered, honestly. We'll see if that gets there. But so had a lovely child, still have a very lovely child. Her father and I divorced when she was about 3. He moved out of state. I moved on to real estate development, remarried in 2015 to a gentleman named Monty Workman, who is from Cleveland, lives here, still lives here. We divorced in 2020. Pandemic got a lot of people. And I'm pretty sure I'm not trying it a third time. Fool me once, fool me twice, can't get fooled again, in the words of some sage, right? Anyhow, that's sort of my personal story. And I did and do truly mean my child is my legacy. But my life's work, much to my surprise, it's not where I expected to find it, is in the real estate work that I do. To a certain extent, I think that Tucson is a real estate town. If you're not paying attention to real estate in Tucson, you're not really paying attention to Tucson. And I was raised to pay attention to real estate to a certain extent, so I've always had an interest in it. But, it's one of those careers, if you don't know, you don't know. There's no path to being a real estate developer, There's a path to being a real estate agent or a broker or an appraiser, although I don't even know how people become appraisers, but there's, paths to that. And I knew that that wasn't quite what I wanted to do in real estate. That always seemed boring to me. And I do have and always have had a real sense of community. I am who I am because I was raised here. This community shaped me, continues to shape me, and I'd like to think it. That is certainly something that I wanted to do with my life, always have. Spent some time when I was young, very active in politics as well. Politics, not for me. I am nobody's politician. Oh, my goodness. I'm surprised I haven't cursed yet. I think I have. Normally, I'm cursing a lot more. So it's part of the reason I don't think I'd make a great politician. But also, it doesn't interest me. But I was really was sort of looking for a way to combine the gratitude that I have for this community, for this actual physical place, and a way to make a living. And it turns out that real estate is that. You just have to be very careful at it, and now that I am where I am in this, my, 5th and hopefully final career, it can look like a very obvious story. It can look like I intentionally chose to do boutique hotels. I intentionally chose to create a place for community, for people. None of that is true. I like to be, when people ask me how and why I did what I did and do what I do, I like to be very honest, and I like to say I was forced to. I mean, I wasn't forced to be a real estate developer. I chose to do that, although it was probably my last best hope, where I was running out of careers, frankly, that I could do. I did choose to do that. But I had, people that I knew who were in the field, property managers, actual real estate developers, et cetera. And I didn't quite know what I was getting into. They encouraged me, but I didn't know what I was getting into. But I was encouraged to go a traditional route, to just build apartments or just do single-family home building or build a strip mall. Or if you're going to do a hotel, God forbid you do a hotel, but if you're going to do a hotel, make sure it has a brand, make sure it's a Marriott, make sure it's a Hilton, et cetera. I didn't know what I was doing, so I thought, sure, fine, I'll try to do that. That makes sense, whatever. And it turns out that the first parcel of real estate I ever purchased, actually, the first parcel of real estate I ever purchased was from the Urban League. It had been housing, it had been transitional housing for the Urban League, but had been long abandoned by them. They were selling it, but they weren't using it. Over there on Glen and Euclid, Glen and First, Blackledge actually was the crossroads, purchased that property, not readapted, just basically redeveloped is probably the right word, although, yeah, redeveloped that into just workforce housing, private workforce housing, sold that property. It was a sweet little project to do. But then the second property I did, I really think of it as my first, was an empty lot in downtown Tucson and an old motel located at 475 East 16th Street in Armory Park, where I currently live in Armory Park. So I was familiar with the property, picked it up out of an estate sale from my time as practicing law. It didn't really hit the market. It was sort of an unloved piece of property. It wasn't even considered part of downtown Tucson, which was shocking to me. No one liked it. Nobody cared about it. I was told I'd made a mistake buying so far from anywhere anybody wanted to be, buying in such a crime-ridden neighborhood, any of that sort of stuff. But I liked the property quite a bit. I really did have a soft spot for it, particularly that sort of unloved little building, the old building that was built in 48. And while I was trying to figure out what to do with the empty lot, I thought, well, let me just turn this building back into a hotel. Let me just turn it into a little something for the neighborhood, right? Just whatever, while I figure out what I do with this big empty lot right next door to it. And thinking, let me just turn this into a little something for the neighborhood, was game changer. That was the first time I ever intentionally thought about creating a place for a community, for a set of people who were rooted in a place and cared about a place. And I took that very seriously. Those first 10 rooms were so much more for the two neighborhoods that surrounded it than they were for any travelers. People would stay, still do actually, but would stay at the hotel when their family was in town. They'd give up their houses and they'd stay at the hotel, or they'd stay when their AC was out, or they'd stay when they wanted a staycation. We had nothing but a dirt parking lot and a huge dirt lot next door, and we would do quarterly pig roasts for the neighborhood because somebody gave me a kahachina, and why wouldn't I take the chance to butcher a pig? It was a lot of fun. We would do concerts. We would just randomly cook dinner on a Tuesday, like potluck dinner, just in a dirt parking lot. Our coffee was free to anybody who walked by in the neighborhood. And that really took off on the internet. Social media sort of took off at the same time that our hotel really got up and running. And then boutiques as well in the desert Southwest. Tucson particularly started having a moment. So I got really lucky. I was really lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And even from the beginning, people asked me, how did you do this? Why did you do this? Why here? And that's when it became sort of more clear to me. And I should have brought the magazine in with the quote because it's one of my favorite quotes I ever did. I was asked, oh, Tucson has the ability to be the next Austin, the next Portland. Is this what you're looking for? Is this why you did this? And I remember very clearly my answer was no. That's not why I did this. I'm not interested in Tucson being the next Austin. I'm not interested in Tucson being the next Portland. I'm interested in Tucson being the best community it can be. And I stayed here because I give a shit about that. And the only way Tucson becomes that is if people who are, I shouldn't say born and raised, but people who care about this community stay their asses put. And that's what I did. And that's sort of what I think my calling is to stay put and contribute to a place being a place, being a home, a community worth living, worth being in, worth caring about, worth fighting for if you have to. It's a gift for me to be able to do that, to give that to downtown, to give that to Armory Park, to give that to the barrio, to give that to the Black community, honestly, to find the Black community through the place that I've created is not a thing that I expected. I expected to go a more traditional route and find the Black community through something like the Black Chamber of Commerce, the dearly departed Black Chamber of Commerce, to find it through the Urban League, the dearly departed Urban League here, or NAACP, or through, African American History Museum now, but I never expected to build a place and have the community come to me, and to be able to see and experience a Black community that is younger, bigger, more economically diverse, more ethnically diverse, honestly, than I grew up with, than I experienced. Me growing up, I grew up with, if you were Black in Tucson, you were middle class because you had a military background, or you were poor. That's it. I didn't know there was any in between. I didn't know. I shouldn't say I didn't know, right? There are some attorneys that I met as I got older along the way. There's definitely, a Black professional community in Tucson that I was unaware of growing up. But just to see the entire diversity of it now it's amazing. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And I am honored to be a part of that.